When I got the call that day, standing outside the greasy window of the cafe, the first thing I noticed wasn't the words, but the way the sunlight hit the wet street, making everything look silver and distant, like a dream that was about to break. It was my father's doctor, and the voice on the line was tight and professional, the kind that doesn't waste time on pleasantries before delivering a punch you already knew was coming. He explained, in that careful, clinical language that only makes the truth hurt more, that the last surgery hadn't been enough, that the remaining bills were now past due, and that without immediate payment, a staggering number that felt like a joke designed only for people who had already lost everything, they would have to stop treatment. I remember standing there, holding the cheap phone to my ear, the plastic warm and slick against my cheek, listening to the static of the street and the static of my own fear, thinking about the apartment we had already sold, the few miserable boxes of things we had left stacked in the corner of my tiny rented room, and the way my hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that everything I had scraped and begged and worked for had been just enough to keep us alive, but not enough to actually save him. For years, I had believed in the simple virtue of sheer effort, the idea that if I just kept my head down, worked double shifts, and lived on rice and instant coffee, I could outrun the crushing weight of circumstance. But the doctor's monotone voice was proof that some races are rigged from the start. Some finish lines are moved just when you think you're about to cross them. My father, the man who taught me how to read the ancient dialects of our city, and who believed, foolishly, that a deep love for language was more valuable than a deep bank account, was going to pay the final price for my failure to finish school and become something more than just a waitress. I had dropped out of the linguistics program 3 years prior, just a few credits shy of the degree that would have given me a respected profession and the salary to stop this endless bleeding. And the guilt of prioritizing my meager earnings over finishing my education was a constant, sharp ache. That was the moment that truly broke me. Not the debt itself, but the cold, cruel fact that my resilience, my quiet dignity, and my endless work ethic were utterly meaningless against the towering reality of money and power. A system that didn't care about my moral strength or my exhaustion, only the zeros in my bank account, only the speed with which I could accumulate capital. The rain started falling harder then, blurring the reflection in the window, and I felt the tears welling up. But they never fell. I couldn't afford to cry, not when the air in my father's lungs depended on my composure. The sheer injustice of being so close to saving him, yet so fundamentally powerless, pressed down on me like a physical weight, heavier than any tray I had ever carried. I walked back into the cafe, my legs feeling heavy and disconnected from my body, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant momentarily overwhelming, and I tried to focus on wiping down the counter, trying to turn my mind into a blank, clean slate, the way I had learned to do years ago when the bills first started piling up and the shame became too much to bear. The cafe itself was a study in fluorescent decay. Cracked plastic seats, a persistent, annoying drip under the espresso machine that no one ever fixed, and the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but nervous, anticipating the next inevitable disaster. That's when the door slammed open, letting in a gust of cold, rainy air and the sound of heavy leather shoes, and 4 men in dark, perfectly tailored suits entered. And I mean tailored. The kind of suits that cost more than I made in a year. Suits cut from fabric so rich it seemed to absorb all available light. Suits that announced, without a single word, exactly who they were and why everyone in the room suddenly went absolutely silent, freezing mid-chew or mid-sip, their eyes locked on the leader. Their entrance wasn't just a walk, it was an event, a palpable displacement of the atmosphere, and even the air conditioning seemed to hum quieter in their presence, deferring to the new gravity in the room. He was Don Alessandro Vitale, and even if you had never seen a picture of him, you knew it instantly. The gravity he carried, the way the air shifted around him, the cold, calculating intelligence in his dark eyes, and the sheer, physical sense of danger that clung to him like a shadow, radiating outward into the small, confined space. He didn't look like a cartoon villain. He was handsome, 40-something, with lines of fatigue around his eyes that suggested endless, sleepless vigilance in a brutal world, and utterly magnetic. But when his gaze swept across the room, ignoring the desperate manager and the huddled customers, and finally landed on me, holding the wet rag, I felt utterly exposed, stripped bare of my humble defenses, like an insect suddenly illuminated under a spotlight. He walked straight up to the counter, not looking at the menu or the register, or even acknowledging the manager who was suddenly standing rigid as a statue against the back wall, just looking straight into my eyes. And he smiled. A quick, sharp flash of something that didn't reach his eyes, and that's when he delivered the line that would change everything. The line that felt like a casual bullet to the center of my chest, just after I'd already been hit with the worst news of my life. "Talk to me in Neapolitan?" he said, his voice deep, smooth, and carrying a mocking undertone that made the whole cafe audience lean in, straining to catch every word. "And I'll give you $7,000 right now." The way he emphasized the number, stretching out the word 7, as if it were an object of triviality, something he might find in the bottom of his pocket, was the most humiliating part of the performance. It wasn't a generous offer. It was a joke on my poverty, making my desperate need the object of the entire room's attention. I was so stunned, and still reeling from the doctor's call, that my brain couldn't process the insult behind the request. It only heard the number, $7,000, the exact amount I needed to keep my father breathing for another month, and buy us just a little bit of crucial time. My face must have turned bright red, betraying my quiet embarrassment, and my immediate, desperate calculation. And when I opened my mouth to reply, hoping to muster a few coherent words in the dialect I had studied in books, but rarely spoke aloud, all that came out was a jumble of the old, academic Italian I'd studied mixed clumsily with the street dialect I'd grown up hearing, but never mastered. A chaotic mess of half-formed words and stuttered phrases that sounded absolutely ridiculous, the equivalent of a theatrical stammer from someone clearly out of their depth. A language student failing the simplest pop quiz. The room immediately exploded with harsh, roaring laughter. A cruel, collective release of tension that seemed to focus all the ridicule onto my single, small figure behind the counter, making my ears ring with the sound of my own profound ineptitude. One of Vitale's men, a rough-looking guy named Matteo, his shoulders impossibly broad and his eyes full of cold amusement, sneered, reached into his own pocket, and threw a handful of small, crumpled bills onto the counter, maybe €10 in total, certainly not the 7,000 he'd promised, calling out over the din, "That's your payment, clown girl. Go buy yourself a dictionary and maybe a personality, if they sell those cheap. Don't waste the boss's time." The world seemed to slow down as those grimy bills scattered across the formica, catching the dull light from the ceiling, and I felt the humiliation sink into my bones, heavy and suffocating. Exactly the kind of moment I had spent my life trying to avoid. Being seen, being judged, and being utterly dismissed as a poverty-stricken joke. The scattered bills were like confetti celebrating my failure. I remember just staring at the money, knowing I had to pick it up because it was still money, still desperately needed, still worth something towards my impossible goal, and as I started to bend down, my manager, a squat, red-faced man, named Enrico, who was terrified of everyone and everything, grabbed me by the ear with a grip that was surprisingly painful and hissed through his teeth. The smell of garlic breath heavy in the air. "Who do you think you are, touching his world? You'll ruin us all, idiot. Leave it. You want to start trouble for €70? He yanked me back up, pulling me away from the money, the boss's cold, brief laughter ringing in my ears as they turned and walked out just as quickly as they had arrived. The cafe door snapping shut behind them and leaving behind a silence far colder than the rain outside. That's when it hit me. The joke wasn't about my poor Neapolitan. It was about the audacity of a girl like me, who barely owned the shoes she stood in, to even think she could play in the high-stakes game of their world, even for a moment, even for the life of her father. The way Vitale had looked at me, that brief flicker of something unreadable, like a scientist observing a curious but ultimately insignificant phenomenon, It told me he hadn't seen a person, but an object, a momentary distraction in his very serious, very dangerous life, and the memory of that raw contempt made my stomach twist with a bitter mixture of shame and quiet, unshakable rage. I had been invisible for so long, and the first time I was seen, I was mocked. My worth calculated and found wanting. I spent the next few hours just going through the motions, serving the few remaining customers who were still whispering about the incident and pointing subtly, my chest feeling tight, trying to breathe past the knot of anxiety and embarrassment that was lodged deep in my throat, knowing that the fear of losing my father was now compounded by the immediate, practical problem of finding that $7,000 by the end of the week. That heavy sense of having nowhere to turn, of having worked so hard just to fail, is a feeling I know many people understand. The feeling of being invisible until the moment someone decides to make you a joke, to use your weakness for their entertainment. It's a lonely place, carrying that weight, the burden of being underestimated and dismissed, and if you've ever been there, if you've ever felt the world look straight through you, then you know exactly what I mean. I'm just going to take a quick pause here, before I dive into the truly unbelievable parts of this story, and ask you, if you're watching this and it resonates with you even a little, to take a moment and open your phone, maybe like this video, leave a comment below about a time you felt underestimated, and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me share these hard-won stories, and trust me, you're going to want to hear what happens next, because it gets absolutely insane, and I wouldn't want you to miss any of it. That night, after my shift finally ended, I went back to the tiny rented room I shared, the one that smelled permanently of Old Spice and mothballs and had a window that only looked out onto a brick wall, and I couldn't sleep. I didn't even bother turning on the harsh overhead light, preferring the anonymity of the darkness. I replayed the whole humiliating scene in my head 1,000 times, kicking myself for freezing up, wishing I had said something sharp, something cutting, anything other than that clumsy mess of language, but mostly I just stared at the ceiling and felt the cold, hard weight of reality pressing down, physically pinning me to the mattress. What I didn't know was that while I was lying there in my misery, trying to will myself into unconsciousness, Don Vitale was also awake, not tossing and turning with regret or guilt, but with a different kind of obsession entirely. Matteo told me later that Vitale had recorded the exchange on his phone, not to laugh at it with his associates, but to listen to it privately in the soundproof sanctuary of his study. He sat in his sprawling, silent mansion, an imposing structure of dark stone and shadowed halls, surrounded by the kind of heavy, dark wood furniture that absorbed all sound and light, replaying the little clip of my voice again and again. It was a crude, low-quality recording, punctuated by the raucous laughter of his men. But in the background, there was my voice, earnest and slightly trembling, struggling with the syllables. He was captivated by the sincere, earnest tone that shone through the grammatical errors. The way the few words I managed to string together held a specific, almost musical cadence that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, a rhythm he associated with a distant, purer Naples, the Naples of his childhood. It wasn't the mistake he was listening to. It was the way I dared to try. The sound of my voice speaking a language that belonged to him, but in a way that was entirely mine, flawed and earnest, yet profoundly rooted in the old city's heart. He kept repeating the same phrase to his men, a phrase that made no sense to them as they stood silently waiting for orders, his eyes distant as if looking into a memory. Find me the girl who can't speak Neapolitan right. Her voice is the sound of an honest mistake, and that is a rare thing in this city. He wasn't angry. He was hooked, intrigued by the unexpected authenticity in my stammer, a signal that my intentions were simple and uncalculated. And when Matteo showed up at my door the next morning, not with a goon squad, but with a ridiculously expensive black Mercedes and a politely terrifying demeanor that promised both luxury and menace, I genuinely thought I was being taken to the basement to be punished for offending the local Mafia boss and not for a new job. The sheer absurdity of the abrupt summons did nothing to calm the violent fluttering in my stomach. I was trembling, physically shaking with genuine, icy fear. the terror so profound it made my joints ache and my breathing shallow, as they escorted me into the depths of the mansion, through a labyrinth of dark corridors lined with antique armor and oil paintings depicting dour ancestors, and down a spiraling stone staircase into a chilly, stone-walled room that turned out to be Don Vitale's private, immense wine cellar. The air here was heavy, saturated with the smell of earth, old oak, and an unnameable, ancient power that spoke of generations of wealth and control. A place designed to feel like a vault, safe and eternal. The descent felt endless, a journey into the heart of his carefully constructed, menacing world. I stood there, expecting a beating, a threat, or maybe just a simple, cruel execution, bracing myself against the stone wall, trying to maintain my quiet composure, my hands gripping the strap of my threadbare shoulder bag, so tightly my knuckles were white and aching. But Vitale wasn't screaming. He was sitting at a small, elegant wrought iron table amidst the towering racks of bottles, examining a crystal wine glass as if it contained the secret to the universe. His expression unreadable, almost contemplative, like a philosopher who had stumbled upon a paradox. He didn't mention the money, the joke, or the cafe. He simply set the glass down, looked up at me with those cold, penetrating eyes, and asked, in a quiet voice that somehow held more menace than a shout, a voice that demanded an answer without raising its pitch. "Why did you dare talk back to me? After all, you knew who I was. Why risk that moment of defiance?" I remember taking a deep, ragged breath, the smell of the wine filling my lungs, and the sheer absurdity of the situation. Me, the girl worried about a $7,000 debt, standing in a $1 million cellar being interrogated by a Mafia kingpin, finally broke through the fear, leaving only weary honesty. My voice, surprisingly steady, responded to the strange, non-threatening question with the simple, raw truth. "Because I thought you were joking, sir. It sounded like a performance, a challenge with no real stakes for you, only for me." And then, it happened. Slowly, starting as a barely audible rumble in his chest, Vitale laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed strangely off the stone walls, a sound that resonated with a kind of forgotten joy and a hint of real surprise. Matteo and the others stood frozen to hear it, rigid against the walls, because I found out later that no one in his organization had heard him laugh like that in years, not since his mother had died. It was a sound that seemed to shake something loose in the heavily guarded man, a moment of unguarded humanity. And in that moment, I realized that my flawed voice hadn't just embarrassed me. It had unintentionally reached past his defenses and touched something human, something long buried and forgotten, something that responded to simple, unvarnished honesty and a bit of reckless courage. The fear, however, didn't immediately evaporate, even after the laugh. It simply morphed into a bewildering confusion, as Vitale, instead of releasing me, informed me that I was now hired. He didn't ask if I wanted the job, or if I could do it. He simply stated, with the quiet authority of a king issuing a decree, that I was now his private Neapolitan tutor, tasked with improving his already proficient but too modern dialect to a purer, older form, and that my salary would be enough to cover my father's bills, and then some, paid into an anonymous account with meticulous regularity. The job wasn't about linguistics. It was about proximity, access, and control. The sheer irony of the situation was a bitter pill. I, who had dropped out of university because of money, who couldn't even speak the language properly under pressure, was now employed by a powerful man to teach him the history and rhythm of his own tongue, essentially becoming his captive scholar. The other men in the house couldn't believe it, and their disbelief quickly turned into cruel, constant mockery. A low-level campaign of psychological warfare designed to wear me down and remind me of my place. Matteo, especially, looked at me with open contempt, his jaw clenched, calling me the language doll behind my back. And during the hours I was forced to spend in the cavernous, oppressive library, trying to decipher old texts and explain grammatical structures I barely understood, the guards would often pass by and sneer through the doorway. "That girl reads Italian like a toddler," one of them would whisper loudly to the other, making sure I could hear every word. And she's teaching the boss? What, is this some kind of extended joke we're all supposed to be in on? Maybe she's just good at making coffee, eh? Their words, though delivered lightly, were designed to sting, and they hit my deepest insecurity. The fact that I was an amateur, a nobody with no official qualifications, a failure, and that I was constantly on the verge of being exposed as the fraud they already believed me to be. I started wearing my quiet resilience like a shield, refusing to meet their eyes, never responding to their jibes, just setting my jaw and returning my attention to the dusty, complicated books, letting my focused silence and absolute, undeniable work ethic be my only defense against their calculated cruelty. I focused so intently that the complex script of the medieval documents seemed to be the only real, solid thing in that entire house of shadows. The dynamic became even more complicated and infinitely more painful when Francesca De Luca arrived, bringing with her a wave of pure, aristocratic hostility and a claim to the seat of power that she believed was rightfully hers. She was Don Vitale's former fiancée, the daughter of a rival Mafia boss, a woman who radiated an icy, self-assured entitlement, moving through the mansion like she owned the very air we breathed, every gesture perfectly calculated to convey effortless power and untouchable wealth. Her clothes and jewelry proclaiming her status in every reflective surface, designed to make my simple dress look like a costume or a mistake. She saw me, the shy, plainly dressed tutor working at the corner of the massive mahogany table, and her beautiful, cruel eyes narrowed with immediate, intense rivalry. To her, I wasn't just low-status competition. I was an offense to the entire world she represented, a sign of Vitale's poor taste, or, worse, his declining seriousness. She made a point of seeking me out, usually when Vitale was nearby but distracted by paperwork, and her voice, dripping with saccharine condescension, would slice through the quiet of the room. "That filthy dialect doesn't belong at a Mafia table, Alessandro," she'd say, not even looking at me, but directing the insult at him, as if I were a piece of tacky decor he had carelessly acquired and should be thrown out with the trash. She would also comment on my hands, which were always slightly rough from years of manual labor, remarking loudly how unsuited they were for the delicate work of handling ancient texts. The real test came during a sprawling family dinner, a tense, formal affair where everyone was dressed in severe black, and the atmosphere felt like a high-stakes chess match played with knives, the silverware clinking ominously against the fine porcelain. Vitale had asked me a simple question about the ancient Neapolitan word for honor, its specific historical meaning in relation to the clans, focusing on the subtle, forgotten distinction between onore, reputation, and rispetto, deference, a point that went far beyond mere vocabulary. And as I began to formulate my answer, choosing my words carefully, trying to avoid my previous clumsiness, Francesca suddenly cut in with a theatrical sigh of boredom. She then proceeded to perfectly mimic my slightly nervous, mixed dialect pronunciation, stretching the vowel sounds and contorting the consonants in a vicious caricature, making the historical word sound like an embarrassing, ignorant farm girl blunder that had no place in their sophisticated discussion of power. The entire table, a collection of powerful, dangerous men, burst into a wave of laughter that was colder and sharper than the cafe's mockery, and I felt my cheeks burning, the heat spreading down my neck, my hands tightening under the table as I fought the urge to simply run, to vanish. I looked instinctively at Vitale, searching for some flicker of support, some sign that he didn't see me as a joke too. But he remained utterly silent, his expression blank, simply watching the scene unfold like a detached sovereign. And in that agonizing silence, I was convinced that I was nothing more than a temporary language doll, brought in for his amusement, until he got bored and tossed me aside. His inaction felt like the sharpest possible form of abandonment. I felt that familiar, heavy certainty of being an outsider, a pawn, a placeholder, creeping back in. But something deep inside, perhaps that inherent resilience my father had always admired, refused to let me simply quit and go back to my old, desperate life. The shame fueled a cold determination. I threw myself into the language with the obsessive fervor of a scholar seeking redemption, retreating into the sprawling, dusty library whenever I wasn't with my father, or working on my ridiculous tutoring sessions with Vitale. I sought out the oldest, most obscure texts, driven by a quiet, determined need to prove them all wrong and find the true, untainted source of this magnificent, complex language. The library became my sanctuary, a maze of knowledge where the opinions of men like Matteo and Francesca simply couldn't reach me. It was in one of those forgotten corners, past the predictable leather-bound classics that everyone consulted, that I stumbled upon a small, unmarked section hidden behind a rolling ladder, an area filled with brittle, hand-stitched manuscripts, tied with faded ribbon, clearly never meant for public view, tucked away as if they were too personal or too potent to display. They were not official records or famous poems, but personal writings, letters, and diaries, and the most captivating of them was a fragile, leather-bound volume written in a flowing, antiquated script. The personal diary of Vitale's mother, the one who had been murdered years ago in some act of betrayal that everyone spoke of in hushed, frightened tones, as if saying her name too loudly would bring bad luck. The pages were thin and smelled faintly of lavender and age, a sensory link to a woman who had once navigated this dangerous world with grace. I began to spend hours translating it, fascinated by the rhythm of her life and her thoughts. Written in a Neapolitan dialect so ancient and specific, it felt like decoding hieroglyphics, a true relic of the city's heart, detailing the family's life before the blood and the power took over. Back when honor truly meant integrity, one afternoon, while sitting alone, basking in the single shaft of sunlight that penetrated the high library window, I started reading one of her entries aloud to myself, just to feel the shape of the words on my tongue and practice the difficult, forgotten pronunciations. I was translating a few lines that described a hidden safe place for her childhood drawings, a simple, deeply personal memory, a nostalgic instruction for a child. The entry talked about how her father had taught her a specific way to say, "Return to me, my love," and that this phrase, when spoken with the right inflection, was her key. As I spoke a specific, oddly phrased couplet of the ancient dialect, a phrase that sounded almost like a nursery rhyme, focused on the word return, I heard a low, mechanical grinding sound, followed by a soft, metallic click that cut through the silence like a gunshot. My heart leaped into my throat. Suddenly, a huge section of the bookshelf directly in front of me slid silently back, retracting smoothly into the wall, revealing a gleaming, high-tech vault behind it, lit by a thin, internal spotlight that caught the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating a modern lock and a retinal scanner. I gasped, dropping the diary on the plush carpet, the sound muffled by the thick pile, and before I could even fully process what had happened, Vitale was suddenly standing in the doorway, having clearly heard the mechanical sound from his adjoining study. His face was pale, his eyes wide and fixed on the open vault, an expression of sheer shock and disbelief that I had never seen on his otherwise impassive face, his entire demeanor crumbling into something vulnerable and human, stripped bare of his dangerous composure. His voice, when it came, was a low, ragged whisper that tore through the air, completely devoid of his usual command or irony, sounding only like a frightened, grief-stricken man confronting a miracle. Only my mother knew how to read that dialect, and to speak that phrase. It was her secret heart, her way of keeping things safe from the world. He took a hesitant step closer, his focus intense, his whole body radiating a magnetic, desperate energy. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The little phrase I had just uttered, the clumsy words I had struggled to pronounce, weren't just a nostalgic entry in a diary. They were an ancient password, a key forged in love and blood, and I, the underestimated girl who couldn't speak the dialect properly, had just unlocked the most sacred, most deeply buried secret of his entire world. I looked from the open vault, glittering with secrets and forgotten treasures, to the trembling man before me, and I realized that my initial linguistic mistake, the awkwardness that had earned me so much mockery, was the very thing that had brought me into contact with the true soul of Don Alessandro Vitale. The the part of him that was still a vulnerable son, haunted by the past and desperate for connection. It was a language of absolute truth. From that moment forward, everything shifted. The tutoring was no longer a joke or an amusement, but a ceremony, a profound exchange of trust and shared secret. He began teaching me himself, with endless patience and intense focus, not as a demanding boss instructing an incompetent doll, but as a man passing on an irreplaceable inheritance, revealing the language not just as words, but as the very foundation of his heritage, the true tragic history of his family line, using the ancient dialect as a means to tell the story of his life, his triumphs, and his deepest sorrows. This new proximity and the shared secret only increased the hostility around us, especially from Matteo, who had now transitioned from casual contempt to outright murderous suspicion, seeing the growing bond as a direct threat to his own carefully cultivated position as second in command. He viewed me with undisguised venom, his dark eyes following me with the predatory intensity of a hunter, convinced that my sudden access to the boss's inner sanctum could only mean I was an interloper, or worse, a spy sent to map the organization's soft underbelly. He started spreading uglier rumors, whispering behind closed doors about my humble origins and how easily a girl desperate for money could be turned by a rival faction to steal sensitive information or plant a listening device, twisting my past into a tool of malice and calling me the poverty magnet. He even started leaving specific papers in my path, seemingly innocuous documents about bank transfers, hoping I would be tempted to glance at them and prove his theory. The tension was palpable, a constant, low-burning threat that followed me down every hallway. And one afternoon, as I was walking through one of the back corridors, carrying a folder of the newly translated texts we were working on, Matteo cornered me right near the kitchen entrance, where he knew the staff would be watching but too terrified to intervene, and where the lighting was deliberately dim. There were a couple of heavy-set guards nearby, men loyal only to Matteo, and he clearly intended to make a public show of force, a calculated display of dominance designed to put me back in my place and scare me off once and for all, demonstrating that his authority hadn't faded. He blocked my path, his face twisted in a mask of furious contempt, and before I could even process the warning in his eyes or step back, he raised his hand and struck me hard across the face. A flat, stinging slap that snapped my head back and made the papers fall from my hand, scattering across the highly polished marble floor. "You talk too much, waitress," he snarled, his voice loud enough to carry, ensuring his message was received by everyone listening. "And you have sticky fingers. This is just a reminder of who you are and where you come from. Don't forget your station and who owns your life." I didn't cry, or scream, or even rub my cheek, which was now throbbing with pain. I simply looked at him, my eyes steady and cold, the shock instantly replaced by a deep, quiet rage that felt like a block of ice settling in my chest, a cold resolve not to be broken. I started slowly, deliberately bending down to gather the scattered documents, showing him with my controlled silence that his cheap, bullying act hadn't broken my spirit or my focus, only hardened it, and added another layer to my quiet strength. The true betrayal, however, came from the man I had begun to trust, the man who was now sharing his mother's legacy with me. Don Vitale. He was told about the slap. Matteo made sure of that, framing it as a necessary disciplinary action against a disruptive servant who was growing too bold and stepping out of line. But when Vitale finally looked at me later that evening, his gaze was utterly unreadable, neither angry at Matteo nor protective of me. Just a cold, distant assessment that left me feeling more desolate than the physical pain had. He didn't offer comfort or retribution, just a long, evaluating stare, weighing the optics of my humiliation against the loyalty of his captain. His silence, once again, made me feel like a disposable object, confirming that in his world, my well-being was utterly insignificant when weighed against the need to maintain a facade of organizational order or avoid internal conflict within his ranks. To make matters worse, Francesca saw her chance and seized it immediately, using her deep understanding of the family's old politics and her network of informants. She somehow obtained photos of me working with the mother's diary, specifically images of me holding the fragile pages, twisting the images and leaking information to key figures in the organization, convincing everyone that I wasn't just a potential spy, but an outright fraud, someone who was actively attempting to steal the legacy of the Vitale matriarch by pretending to be her successor, a gold digger after a bloodline. She spread the poisonous lie that I had found the diary purely by accident and was leveraging the ancient text for power. Within hours, the tide had turned completely. I went from being the boss's curious new apprentice to a marked traitor. And before I could even try to defend myself or explain the truth of the Moretti bloodline, Matteo and 2 other burly guards were dragging me away, ignoring my quiet, firm pleas for a moment to speak to Vitale, their faces grim with self-satisfaction. They didn't take me to a comfortable waiting room. They threw me roughly into a small, windowless, stone chamber in the deepest part of the house. A dark, freezing room that I later learned was notoriously used for torturing those accused of betrayal. A clear message that my life was now over, and that I had been reduced to a pawn marked for sacrifice, discarded as easily as a broken toy. The cold, heavy air of the chamber settled around me, confirming my status as utterly alone and abandoned. As the heavy, iron-bound door slammed shut, plunging me into absolute darkness and silence, the sound echoing ominously down the corridor, I slumped against the cold stone floor, the lingering shame and humiliation finally giving way to a sickening wave of despair. I felt a profound, crushing sense of being utterly alone, having risked everything and failed spectacularly, confirming every single sneer and insult ever hurled my way. I was just a waitress, an unfinished student, and I had foolishly believed that a powerful man could see my worth beyond my station. But now I knew the truth. I was just a disposable tool in a game I didn't understand. I sat in that cell for hours, the air growing colder, the dampness seeping into my clothes, my mind replaying the moments of mockery, the feel of Matteo's slap, and the crushing silence of Don Vitale's betrayal, until the sound of the iron door rattling open jolted me back to the present. The interrogation started immediately, brutal and relentless, not with physical pain at first, but with a psychological onslaught, demands for information I didn't have, accusations I couldn't answer, all delivered in shouted, menacing Italian that I was too exhausted and too terrified to properly process or form a rational defense against. My head swimming with fear and exhaustion, cornered, defeated, and fearing for my life. I wasn't thinking. I was just trying to breathe, trying to hold on to the last shreds of my identity in the face of absolute terror, clinging to the rhythm of my own breath. And in that desperate, subconscious moment, when my conscious mind had entirely failed me, a phrase I had never consciously learned slipped from my lips. It was an ancient Neapolitan prayer, a specific sequence of archaic words my father had once murmured over me when I was a child with a fever, words he said his mother had taught him, a linguistic relic so old it was almost pre-dialect, a forgotten piece of cultural history that my father had passed down as his only real inheritance, a prayer for safety and protection in the darkness that predated any modern church. I didn't choose to say it. The words simply flowed out, a sound rooted deeper than memory, an instinctual cry for comfort in a language that was older than pain itself. What I didn't know was that while the interrogation was happening, Vitale was watching the entire scene on a surveillance feed in his office, his face set in stone, ostensibly letting the necessary procedure play out to placate his men and maintain his facade of non-involvement, but his heart racing with doubt. But when he heard those specific, melodic, almost chant-like words of the prayer, the same words his mother had taught him, the words only 2 people in his entire life had ever spoken, words that carried the precise emotional weight of his earliest memories, of comfort and unconditional love. He froze, his hand visibly shaking as he gripped the desk edge, dropping his pen. The sound was impossible. It was his childhood, his purest sorrow, echoing from the lips of the girl he had just allowed to be tortured. The effect was immediate and absolute. He must have stared at the screen, seeing me, the supposed traitor, speaking the sacred language of his dead mother. He didn't waste a second. He moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked his guards, bursting into the interrogation room like a force of nature, shouting an order that instantly stopped the torture and silenced the room. He didn't look at Matteo or the interrogators. His eyes were fixed entirely on me, his face etched with a frantic, desperate realization, as if he were seeing a ghost or finding a priceless fragment of his lost life returned to him. He rushed to me, tearing the ropes from my wrists with a singular focus, the coarse material scraping my skin, and pulled me into an embrace that was shocking in its raw, protective intensity, holding me tighter than I had ever been held, his entire body trembling with profound emotion. "Only my blood could say those words," he whispered into my hair, his voice choked with a kind of terrified wonder, realizing the words were not just a code, but a genetic echo, a linguistic blueprint he knew intimately. Within the next frantic few hours, a simple genetic test, run using samples taken from me and his mother's preserved family records that had been kept in that secret vault I had opened, confirmed the impossible, the destiny hidden beneath the surface of my humble existence. I was a distant descendant of the Moretti clan, a family once fiercely loyal to his mother, a forgotten fragment of his own bloodline, a loyalty carried in my very DNA, a biological proof of allegiance. Vitale looked at me then, his eyes no longer cold or distant, but burning with a complex mix of guilt, reverence, and sudden, fierce possession, his voice firm and heavy with the weight of revelation. "You're not my captive, Lucia. You're my legacy. You are the proof of what was lost and what can be recovered, the living heart of my family's forgotten history, and I almost let them destroy you." The truth that I was not an outsider, but a living piece of his heritage, a fragment of the loyalty and bloodline he had mourned, turned the shame and humiliation of the previous weeks into something powerful and transformative. I had been judged by my clothes and my job, by my lack of formal status, but it turned out my language and my very DNA were what mattered in this brutal world, and the sheer audacity of destiny left me reeling. The blood test wasn't just a clinical result, it was an undeniable decree, one that silenced every single whisper of Matteo and Francesca and established my worth not through money or connections, but through an ancient inherited right. But in the Mafia world, love and destiny are always cursed, twisted by paranoia and blood, and the whispers began almost immediately, spreading like wildfire through the inner circles that Vitale had gone mad, elevating a common girl to a position of power and protection simply because she reminded him of his dead mother. They couldn't accept that his choice was rational. It had to be driven by madness or sentimentality, anything but genuine love for the person I was. Francesca, whose rivalry was now laced with pure, desperate malice, seized on this rumor like a viper, knowing exactly where to strike for maximum damage. She cornered me in the massive, echoey central hall one afternoon, her voice soft and absolutely devastating, a velvet glove over an iron fist. "You should be honored, little waitress," she mocked, leaning in close, her expensive designer perfume suffocating, forcing me to breathe in her contempt. "But don't mistake this for love. He loves his mother's ghost, Lucia, not you. You are simply a beautifully preserved heirloom, a replacement for a wound that never healed, a convenient link to a past he can't let go of." Her words hit their mark precisely, injecting a sudden, crippling doubt into the warmth of my burgeoning feelings for Vitale. The thought was insidious. Was I loved, or was I merely useful? I began to watch him, searching for the ghost in his eyes when he looked at me, questioning every shared moment, every intense conversation about the ancient texts, wondering if I was simply a vessel for his grief, a projection of his past and not a woman loved for herself, for the resilient person I was today, separate from the blood and the history that defined his power. The doubt became too heavy to bear, too poisonous to live with, and I knew I couldn't build a life, much less a partnership, on the foundation of someone else's memory, even if that memory had saved my life and paid my father's bills. I had been underestimated for my lack of status, and now I was being revered for my lack of existence, for being a ghost, a remnant of a better time. And both were equally unbearable to my quiet, determined soul, which craved honesty above all else. I needed to know I was chosen for my own sake, that I was more than a living artifact. So, one cold morning, while Vitale was locked in a tense, hours-long meeting with his captains, debating territory and logistics following the internal turmoil, I made my decision. I packed my small bag, leaving behind the clothes and possessions he had bought me, taking only the worn satchel I had arrived with, and the precious knowledge I had gained. The only things that were truly mine. The note I left was small, simple stationery placed precisely in the center of his massive mahogany desk, the words clean and final, without accusation or regret. Just the statement of my truth. I cannot be someone's memory. I must be Lucia. I must be. Then I simply walked out the massive front doors, stepping back into the confusing reality of Naples, knowing that I was walking away from safety, from power, and from the one man who had truly seen my hidden worth, even if he had only seen it through the lens of his past. I waited for him to come after me, for the inevitable, terrifying chase that any other Mafia boss would have initiated, for the angry phone calls or the cars at the corner, but it never came. He never called, never sent his men, never gave any indication that he had noticed my departure for 3 long weeks, confirming, in the most painful silence imaginable, the curse of his love, that he knew anyone who left willingly must also choose to return willingly, or not at all, and that if I could walk away, then maybe I was never really his to begin with. He respected my agency, even though it tore me apart. And that was a quiet kind of love I couldn't deny. Even as I walked away from it, I found a small, cheap room in the old city and started working again, picking up shifts as a specialized translator and interpreter for the local police, using the flawless, academic Italian I had been forced to learn during my life as an underestimated student. My work was meticulous, driven by the intense focus I had honed in Vitale's library, interpreting complex legal documents and surveillance intercepts. The police unit was skeptical of me at first, given my background, but my skill in archaic linguistics quickly proved invaluable to them, making me indispensable in their covert operations. I was working for the very people who were trying to bring down Vitale, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I was using the only weapon I truly possessed, my language skills, to survive on my own terms, free of reliance on anyone. My father was stable now, thanks to the money Vitale had paid me, and I was finally starting to build a life that was truly mine, free from both desperate need and ghostly love, grounded in the dignity of my own labor. The air was tense in the city, however, a low simmering fear that everyone felt, because Francesca, along with Matteo and several rival factions, had seized on my departure and the earlier rumors of Vitale's madness to make a decisive move, uniting to seize control of the Vitale group and dismantle his legacy. The war, which everyone had feared, had finally begun, conducted not with gunfire in the streets, but with coded messages and corporate takeovers designed to look legitimate. I was assigned to an emergency briefing, a crucial high-stakes negotiation between a key police unit and an informant, a mission known only as Operation Neapolitan, a massive, covert effort to wipe out the entire Vitale bloodline, an operation I was now unwittingly translating for. During that secret negotiation, sitting at the back of a sterile, brightly lit room, surrounded by nervous officers and flickering screens displaying live audio and visual feeds, I was listening intently to the encrypted communications being funneled through the informant. The dialect being used was not the one the police knew, but an antiquated regional code that only a handful of scholars, and those steeped in the oldest family histories, could possibly understand. I suddenly recognized a pattern in the informant's archaic, specialized Neapolitan code, a sequence of very specific, almost ridiculously obscure linguistic traps and historical references that were completely foreign to the police linguists, who were struggling just to keep up with the basic grammar and cadence. For example, they used the word for market when they meant armory, a subtle misdirection rooted in medieval trading terminology. I had only learned through Vitale's mother's diary. My blood ran cold, because I was the one who had taught that exact sequence to Francesca in the early days. During one of those tense, mocking dinner sessions, in a moment when she'd asked me to explain the historical roots of a complex slang term, hoping to catch me in an error, and I had foolishly shown off, never imagining the words would be used for betrayal. I had recognized it instantly. This was Francesca's voice, speaking through the informant, using a code that was now being used as a weapon to destroy the very man who had unwittingly shared the code's history with me. In that split second, I made the only choice I could. A choice born of loyalty, love, and the profound realization that my strength lay not in my escape, but in my ability to wield the language they had all mocked. I began to deliberately mistranslate the crucial segments of the conversation, inserting minor but critical errors in the police's transcript, subtly changing locations from the coast to the interior, shifting timelines by an hour, and altering key personnel names just enough to mislead the enemy and buy Vitale precious, life-saving time, diverting the police focus toward a false objective. I was playing a game of linguistic chess at the highest stakes, using my forgotten education to save the man who had loved me, ghost or not, recognizing that his life was worth more than my neutrality. As the frantic negotiation came to its climax, with the police preparing to deploy based on my false translation, I walked out of the police translation booth, my posture straight, my eyes fixed on the door to the adjacent conference room where the rival factions were meeting, and I walked right into the room, uninvited and completely unexpected, my plain clothes a stark contrast to the tailored armor of the dangerous people inside. I looked straight at Francesca, who was presiding over the negotiation with a triumphant smirk, and then I turned to the stunned, powerful men in the room, and I spoke, not in the cautious, mixed dialect they had laughed at, but in flawless, ancient, and deeply commanding Neapolitan, the language of his mother, the language of the dead and of the blood. My voice was steady and absolute, and I said the only words that mattered, the words that explained my return. I learned it. For you, my arrival and my sudden, perfect command of the ancient dialect, the language of their deepest power, which I had just used to single-handedly cripple their plan, was a shock that stalled the entire operation. But Francesca was too deep into her coup to retreat, too consumed by her own toxic pride. She recovered quickly, a mask of vicious fury snapping into place. She had me captured instantly, before Vitale could be alerted, her guards swarming me before anyone could react. And with a vicious, triumphant smile, she had me tied to a heavy, ornate chair in the center of the control room she was using as her temporary headquarters. A room filled with monitors displaying the compromised operation and the confused deployment of the police. She set up a live stream, broadcasting my image to every major faction leader in the city, using me as a public symbol of Vitale's downfall and her own ascension. Her voice was sharp and clear for the camera, her tone dripping with spiteful victory. Here's the traitor's heir, the girl who ruined Vitale. Look at what he chose over his business, a sentimental fool who brought a kitchen knife to a gunfight, and now he will pay for his sentiment. Then, the feed switched to Vitale, who was trapped in a compound besieged by Francesca's allies, and the ultimatum was delivered, stark and brutal. Choose, save her, or save your empire. I watched him on the screen, his face a mask of conflict, his eyes reflecting the impossible weight of the choice, and I saw a flicker of the cold calculation return. The moment he hesitated, a pause that lasted only a second, but felt like a lifetime. And in that agonizing, heartbreaking pause, I knew I had been right all along. The empire would always come first, and I was just the catalyst. The hesitation broke my heart completely, a sharp, shattering pain that made the final choice inevitable. Gathering every ounce of breath and the full, terrifying power of the ancient dialect I had mastered, I screamed, not at him, but for him, using the words that meant loyalty and release in that old language, words I now understood fully. I free you, even if it kills me. Do what must be done, Alessandro. Let the empire fall clean. The moment the final syllable left my lips, the entire room began to shake violently, not from an outside attack, but from a deafening internal mechanical roar. I knew instantly what had happened. The phrase, spoken in the ancient dialect with the specific tonal inflections Vitale had taught me, was the exact failsafe, the sonic trigger for a self-destruct system that Vitale had installed long ago in his core compound, designed to take down his entire compound and his legacy, rather than let it fall into the hands of his enemies. He hadn't hesitated because he was choosing the empire. He had hesitated because he was choosing death, intending to die with his empire and free me in the process by removing the thing they wanted him to trade for me, ensuring his enemies won nothing but rubble. His love wasn't cursed, it was absolute, a self-sacrificial devotion hidden beneath his mask of power, and in that moment of final terror, my own love merged with my language, giving me a terrifying, superhuman strength. The shock was the only thing that gave me the edge. I lunged forward, snapping the rope securing me to the chair with a primal effort that tore the skin on my wrists, ripping the mic from the stand, and I ran toward the communication system, shouting one last time, my voice raw and loud enough to be heard over the rising sirens and the grinding collapse of the walls, broadcasting to the entire city in the most powerful, commanding Neapolitan I could muster, ensuring every monitor and radio heard my defiance. Non morirai senza di me? You will not die without me. I grabbed the stunned Vitale, who had been on his way back into the collapsing compound, intending to set off the main charge, and I dragged him, half carrying, half pulling his heavy, inert body out into the street, just as the base exploded behind us in a deafening, apocalyptic roar, turning the curse of love into a weapon of survival. The concussion threw us both forward, leaving us bruised and bleeding on the damp asphalt, survivors of a self-inflicted nuclear option. We both survived the blast, escaping with serious injuries, I with broken ribs and severe cuts, Vitale with injuries far more profound. But the consequences for those who had wronged us were swift and absolute. Francesca was implicated in the attempted coup, her betrayal broadcast across the city via the disrupted live stream, which caught her stunned, defeated face as the compound exploded, ruining her father's position and leading to her immediate exile and the dismantling of her entire family's power structure. A public scandal that felt like the world simply correcting itself after her poisonous ambition had exposed her own vulnerability, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. Matteo, who had betrayed the man who saved him, disappeared entirely from the organization's radar, vanishing into the shadows of the city's forgotten backstreets, his fate a silent warning to others about the cost of cheap cruelty and disloyalty. He paid for his spite with the loss of everything he knew, stripped of all rank and protection, forced back into the life of a frightened nobody. I had dragged Vitale out of the fire, but the explosion, the shockwave, and the smoke had taken a heavy toll. When he finally awakened in the sterile white of the hospital room, his dark eyes meeting mine, the doctors confirmed that his vocal cords had been permanently destroyed, his magnificent, commanding voice silenced forever. He couldn't speak, couldn't whisper, couldn't utter a sound, forced into perpetual silence, his means of command gone. He was dependent on me now, fully and undeniably, and when he finally managed to communicate, his expression softened with a gratitude that transcended language. He took my hand, his grip firm and steady, and with a shaky, deliberate finger, he wrote 4 silent, profound words into the palm of my hand. You'll speak for me now. He wasn't giving me a job. He was transferring his very identity. I walked into the room where the entire Mafia council had assembled. The men who had laughed at me. The men who had dismissed me as a waitress, a clown girl, a language doll, and a ghost. All now sitting in grim, uncertain silence, awaiting the new command structure. I was no longer Lucia Moretti, the student who couldn't pay her father's bills. I was the keeper of the legacy, the blood of his mother, the voice of the man who had lost his own to save his love, and I held the code to his entire existence, the key to the vault, and the key to the future. Vitale sat beside me, silent, his presence still commanding. But his power was now channeled entirely through my quiet strength, a silent force standing next to my spoken word. I didn't need to shout or threaten. I simply stood before the assembly, opened my mouth, and spoke the flawless, ancient Neapolitan, the dialect of blood, loyalty, and undeniable power. My voice was deep, commanding, and absolute, echoing the authority that was now mine, perfectly mimicking the rhythm of leadership I had learned in his library as I met their gazes, one by one, and delivered the first decree of the new era. From now on, my words are his. My words are the only words that matter in this room. My language is your law. Any challenge to my voice is a challenge to his silence, and that will be the last mistake you ever make. And as the entire underworld, the dangerous, calculating men of the council, slowly and deliberately bowed their heads, acknowledging the woman whose language they had once mocked, I knew that the circle was complete. The clumsy joke had become the most powerful truth of all. The invisible girl was finally seen, and her quiet words held the fate of an empire, proving that true power isn't about the volume of your voice, but the weight of your words. I know what it's like to be small, to be told your worth is zero, to be laughed at for trying, to have your most sincere efforts turned into a public spectacle. I carried that shame for years, tucked into the corner of my soul, always trying to be quiet and unnoticed. But the truth, the real truth, is that the thing they mock you for, your sincerity, your earnestness, the flawed but honest way you try to speak their language, that is the very thing that makes you undeniable. You were never small. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below, and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.